Hey, good morning. I'm Peter Dolkart, and I'm the Regional and Community Development Manager at the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond in the Baltimore branch. I can say good morning because we're still on this side of 12 noon. Thank you for joining us for the third day of Baltimore Data Week. I hope you've been able to attend the previous sessions on Monday and Tuesday. We're about halfway through this virtual week. I encourage you to keep on tuning in. We have some exciting sessions to continue. It just keeps on building and building to interesting topics and so on. But we're very glad you joined us today and so on. So this discussion today is on the challenges and successes in housing. I would say I've worked in housing issues, particularly in Maryland and in Baltimore for over 15 years. And the last decade has probably been the most turbulent in housing, both home ownership and rental that I've experienced in my career. We have the Great Recession, which was epicenter for the financial turmoil, was the housing market. We were still recovering from that, and now, of course, we've experienced COVID and what impact that's had on both our lives and so on. So today's discussion is not only taking into account what the experience has been for the last 10 years, but is also to focus on the coming 10 years and so on. So we are going to be taking this is Baltimore Data Week, so we are going to be taking a deep dive right off the bat in our first presentation on a report commissioned by the Maryland General Assembly on housing needs assessment from 2020 to 2030, both in rental and home ownership. Now that's a statewide assessment, but our focus will be ultimately on the greater Baltimore community and so on. So our first segment will be a fairly decent dive into that data and so on. And I will ask our colleagues at the University of Baltimore, Vinia, if they could post that report link so that you can immediately access it and start following along. From there, we will go to Laura Searfoss from the Enterprise Community Foundation, who will give us her perspective across the field, not just in Maryland and in Baltimore, but what she's seeing in other communities when it comes to the challenges and successes in housing. And then finally, we will go to a practitioner here, working right here in Baltimore, Dan Ellis at Neighborhood Housing Services, and his experience providing and producing opportunities for housing right here in our community. Couple things right off the bat. We encourage you to ask questions. This is supposed to be interactive. Now, unfortunately, we can't put you on camera or in audio, so we really do need you to pose your questions in the chat. Don't hesitate as questions come to you. Feel free to post them in the chat. The one thing is that when you do that, please use the chat feature and then also identify who you are. Give us your name in the chat feature and make sure you're selected all panelists and attendees so that we can all see your question and so on. And I thank you. We have posted the report. Also, there is a poll that just finished up. We thank you for participating in that poll. Please stay through the entire session. At the end of the session, there will be an evaluation, and we want your feedback in that as well. So without further ado, since we do have a fair amount of conversations to cover, why don't I introduce our first speaker who will speak to us about the Housing Needs Assessment Report. A couple of things, I don't want to steal his thunder, but some exciting aspects of this report is first the indices, the housing stability indices and the rental stability indice. And then I absolutely enjoy the toolbox that is presented in this report. I really do want you to look at that toolbox and start thinking, well, what works here in Baltimore? What should work here in Baltimore? What other things are opportunities to address, by all means. So without further ado, let me introduce to you Nicholas Finio, who is the Associate Director of the National Center for Smart Growth at University of Maryland, College Park. He is also a PhD candidate in the Urban and Regional Planning Program. His research is focused on the measurement, causes, and consequences of neighborhood change and the links between social inequality and land use and regional planning. And no doubt we're going to see the benefit of that work and research right now. So Nick, please take it away.
Thanks for that introduction, Peter, and it's great to be here, everyone. It's great to see so many attendees. I hope everyone is staying cool. And I'm going to jump right into the housing needs assessment without much of an introduction here because we have a lot to talk about on this great panel. So I'm going to talk about what this housing needs assessment is, which tools are available that were produced for analysis in the document and for users, that being all of you, to take a look at. And that includes the data and some online mapping, which I'll have time to review as well. So if you haven't heard of the Center for Smart Growth, we are a research center based at the University of Maryland College Park. I won't read everything on this slide or most of my slides to you today, but some of you may have encountered us before, or if you have not, you probably are aware of our opportunity mapping, which we did more than 7 years ago now as a part of the Opportunity Collaborative and the Sustainable Communities Initiative, which was very active in the Baltimore region back in the middle part of last decade. But our most recent work, which I collaborated on with Laura Searfoss here at Enterprise Community Partners, is the Maryland Housing Needs Assessment. The link to it was just posted in the chat. And as a little bit of background for you, there was a legislative mandate that came out of the state legislature 3 years ago now that asked DHCD to produce this assessment of affordable housing needs in Maryland. You can see the text of what the legislator was asking for on the right there. In 2019, there was an RFP. The state wanted assistance in this work. The university partnered with Enterprise Community Partners to get it done. We were, of course, like everyone, delayed by COVID. That was sort of a double factor because DHCD at the state level had to start administering federal relief dollars. Not that their attention turned away from this report, but there was simply more to do. We were able to wrap it up right before the legislative session at the beginning of 2021. So this report is public. It's been handed over to the legislature. We're doing some limited rollout with the Community Development Network of Maryland. I know DHCD is sending it around, so it is out there and it's meant to be useful to folks across the state and not just policymakers, but also folks engaging in the advocacy scene in housing. So if you had to condense into one slide, what is this housing needs assessment about? I can give you 3 bullet points. It's supposed to provide accurate analysis about housing needs in the state of Maryland over this current decade out to the year 2030. So after proposing that analysis and looking at the housing problems or issues across the state, there will be a menu of recommendations, including new tools at the state and local levels, which will better align with current and future housing needs. The report focuses on ways to meet the needs for all income groups, so everybody, but we're especially focusing in the report and in our recommendations on families earning less than 30% or less than 60% of area median income. So you'll see a lot of attention to that in our policy recommendations and in the analysis. So as I mentioned, the report itself is pretty big. It's 300 pages long. And this slide just serves as a brief reference with some bullet points as to what's actually in that report. I encourage you all to take a look. So the beginning of the report has a lot of statewide trends and analysis. This stuff is, the big supply and demand issues that are affecting everywhere, stuff that, comes up in Western Maryland, in the DC suburbs, and in Baltimore. But then further down in the report, we get into identification of needs by region. And this was done because you can't really look at housing statewide and have it make a lot of sense. Of course, there's trends that come out statewide, but we know that labor markets and housing markets operate on a regional level, meaning that if you live in and around Baltimore, you're likely to work in and around Baltimore and not likely to work in the Eastern Shore or Southern Maryland, right? So housing markets tend to move and follow trends in these regional areas, which you can see that we divided the state into 5 chunks here. Today, we're going to be talking about the analysis for the Baltimore region. It also includes a policy toolbox, which Peter helpfully mentioned. This menu of actions is not a policy roadmap saying, in 2022, DHCD and the state are going to do this, but rather it's meant to be a list of effective policy options that can address some of the issues that we identify in the report that folks can advocate for, or county or local or state government can enact in order to address these housing issues. Then there are a range of appendices which have a ton more data that we didn't address in the beginning sections of the report, but we wanted to include, including our analysis, technical details of our analysis, the work that we did on engagement, and also our state and local policy review. So that's what's in the report. But today, I'm going to be focusing on one primary tool that was included, which are our stability indexes. Here you can see two maps of the DC region. I'll be showing you some more detailed ones for the Baltimore region. And these are interactive online mapping interfaces that allow you to identify the places in Maryland at the census tract level that have the highest need in terms of their homeownership market or the highest need in terms of their renter market. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means later. And then there's also the toolbox. And again, these are not just static images that you're looking at in a PDF. These are online interactive mapping interfaces, an Excel database that you can interact with the toolbox, and you can also download the data that's behind these indices. So I'll talk about where to get that in a little bit. But first, let's dive into these indices and talk about the analysis that we did. So we were asked by DHCD to identify housing needs by geography. So that meant that we needed to figure out, what are the differences in the housing market at a pretty narrow level. And to do this, we created two indices. One addresses homeowners and one addresses renters. And we did this for every census tract in the state, which is about 1,400 of them. And we ranked those census tracts within each of their home regions, so that you could have a comparison for, say, what's going on in Harford County versus Baltimore City versus Anne Arundel. And we rank those tracts from lowest need in terms of their homeownership needs to highest need. And I will talk about how we did that ranking in a little bit. This is just a more detailed map to show you how those areas are covered. Here's a little bit more information on our data. We relied on a number of sources, primarily the census, but also housing data from CoreLogic and HUD and the National Housing Preservation Database. The technical details are very much written out for a technical audience in the appendix if you want to dig that deep, but we basically looked at all of these variables in each census tract and then computed a z-score relative to the regional average so that we could rank. All variables are treated equally. They're not weighted specially for any of these variables, but you can see which are in each of the indices here. So for example, in the renter index, we're considering the median rent price, or the percentage of renters that are cost burdened, or the percentage of renters that are receiving housing choice vouchers. For homeowners, we're looking at the foreclosure rate and 90-day delinquency rate, or the cost burden for owners. And for both of the indexes, we're looking at a range of demographic, you could call them risk factors or special need factors that we want to pay attention to. So what does this homeowner index do? It creates an index that shows where homeowners are most stressed and the housing market needs the most support. So that means when you say that you have a high need census tract for the homeownership index, that means that tract has a high poverty rate, it has older housing, the cost burden rates, the percentage that people pay towards housing are high. There's high rates of crowding, the home prices are low and have not increased much, and there's high shares of delinquent or foreclosed loans. So these things tend to cluster together geographically, and then these places stand out on the map. As opposed to the high need areas, you have your least in need areas. So these would be places with high incomes. There's more newer housing, lower cost burdens, high home prices, and a few foreclosures or delinquencies. On the renter side, again, we're trying to identify the places on the map that are most stressed in terms of these variables. So a high need renter index tract would be one that has a high poverty rate, again, older housing, but we'd have high renter cost burden and also high rates of residents receiving assistance, so concentrated public intervention in the renter housing market. The least in need renter tracts have lower cost burdens and higher incomes and are much less likely to have renters receiving assistance. So some of you who are familiar with data and mapping are probably already projecting in your heads how these things look, and we'll do that in a little bit. But first, I just want to note that our slides, which will of course be shared today, do have links embedded to where you can interact with these maps, and I'll bring that up in a little bit after I go over some more slides about our findings for the Baltimore area. So again, you can get to the ArcGIS online interface both through links in the report and also through the links in the slides that will be shared. But let's take a closer look in the remaining 10 minutes or so of my presentation at the Baltimore region. So the Baltimore region is big. We have nearly half of the state's, not quite half, but almost half of the state's population living in Baltimore cities and the counties that immediately surround it. So relative to the state average on most housing metrics, Baltimore sits kind of in the middle. Home prices are a little bit below average because those are picked up higher by the DC region. But Baltimore is in many ways kind of average, but that doesn't mean that we don't have concerns. There is a much older housing stock on average in the Baltimore region. We also have high cost burdens, both on the renter and homeowner side. And we also have issues of high poverty and low incomes across the Baltimore region, but especially concentrated in Baltimore City. It's also worth noting that the Baltimore region even though it has slightly lower than statewide average home prices, it had the largest increase in home prices as a percentage between 2000 and 2017. So coming up from a lower base, but a big jump, which affects people at the lower end of the income spectrum. So here's what that homeowner index looks like on a map. And the lighter yellow orange, so these shades down here are the places that are least in need. And as that shade gets darker up to this color, that's the highest need. And you can see a pattern here that, if you know your region, will make sense intuitively. Parts of Howard County and Anne Arundel County are least in need, and the inner suburbs in Anne Arundel, Baltimore County, and also much of Baltimore City show up as a higher need. And why is that? We'll talk about those factors in a little bit, but I do want to point out that in Appendix G, there are many specific details about these categories of need in the report. So if you really want to, rather than just look at the map, if you want to read our analysis of how these things are broken out, you can understand that in Appendix G. So just to highlight one issue, what patterns in the variables are we seeing in these high need areas? So these darker shaded areas here. We picked up in the data that there are high cost burden rates for homeowners in these neighborhoods. So people are paying 30% or even 50% or more towards housing, a higher share than average. There's also high poverty and low household incomes. There's also sort of a disproportionate share of elderly adults and also people with disabilities. And it's also a concentrated minority population in many of these areas. In the report, we didn't just look at the data and leave it at that. We identified needs among homeowners, and then we also identified actions to serve homeowners. So I'm not going to have a ton of time to talk about policy. I think Laura will talk about that a little bit more, but we will address, you can read about how we hope to address these disparities in the report. And there's also the policy actions in the toolbox. On the renter side, you can see a pattern that's pretty similar. Again, going up in the darker shades, you can find the highest need areas. And you'll note that many of these areas are the same as in the homeownership index. And this is because this is just how this tends to work, that our areas that have higher needs in the housing market tend to be geographically concentrated, and that affects both homeowners and renters in those areas. Those places aren't unique in terms of geography. So in these places, we have high renter assistance of public assistance, high utilization rates of that, even though we have these slightly lower than average rents, but we do have an older housing stock in those areas. And again, we're seeing we can see the detailed breakdown of what's going on in the renter index in Appendix G of the report. And we also have our rental market needs and actions identified. So just to give you a little bit more detail on an example of that, you can see that we identified an issue both from the data, but also from talking to stakeholders, which we did throughout the process. We had an advisory group of 30 people, and we had a number of focus groups and interviews beyond that, that there are significant barriers to accessing rental housing in Baltimore City. I'm sure that comes of no surprise to those on the call today, but we do offer some solutions to that, such as increasing tenant education and rental assistance, but also offering incentives and education for landlords. So we try to tailor our policy actions to the needs that come out of the data. And of course, our first one was increasing the supply of income restricted homes to fill in the gap of affordable housing that we do have in the Baltimore region. Here, this is another set of links to the map, which I'm actually going to bring up right now. If you just bear with me for 1 second, I want to show you how you can interact with that. So here, I hope everybody can see this, but this is the ArcGIS online interface that we put together. This is hosted by the University of Maryland, and it's like Google Maps. If you've never used this application before, you can zoom in and click around the region. You'll note that there is this content pane on the left here, and I just want to go over what's in there. You can turn off the homeownership ranking and turn on the rent ranking. So you can see that what I was showing you on the slideshow is just a screenshot of what we have here. But that's not the only thing that's on the map. We also included a range of other policy areas, both federal and state, that may be of interest in terms of how they interact with housing policy. So for example, you could see the difficult development areas from HUD, which are the areas where it's more expensive to build housing. So you can see where those overlay these zones. If you're familiar with opportunity zones, that federal government policy, you can see where those are on the map. And then there's a range of other items like qualified census tracts or enterprise zones that you can turn on and off here. And I just wanted to show you that if you zoom in, you can get all the way down to the census tract level to look at Baltimore City. You can also change your base map if you want to have a satellite image. And here you can actually see, if you click on a census tract, you can see the data that underlies it. So you can see that this one shows up as rank number 5 in the index. And then we have all of these z-scores to show you how it's comparing against the other census tract. And if you follow the links in the report, you can also find a place to download the data yourself and sort through it in Excel if you want to see how we ended up with these calculations as to why these specific neighborhoods show up as higher need. And again, you can do that for both the homeownership and the rental index. I'm actually going to stop there and see if there's any time for questions. So I'm going to bring my PowerPoint back up and see if there's anything in the Q&A or any questions here.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. I appreciate it. I know you're just scratching the surface, but the wonderful thing about this is it is interactive. So we did actually get a question from Jessica Price about how they can access that map. If we can put a link in the chat so that people can actually start playing with that map as we speak. That would be wonderful. I'll ask the staff. Is it also accessible in the report itself?
Yes, there's links in the report, and when I'm done with the Q&A and questions, I'll be able to put in links into the chat.
Great. And then we also had a question. TJ Butler wanted to know, why is the housing index for high need determined by low housing prices? Doesn't that not help with affordability? So yeah, that's an interesting one. I think what we're looking at there is not necessarily affordability, but where, so we had to do it either way, right? It would have been, where are housing prices low and they haven't been going up, or they've actually been falling, which can indicate, a lack of investment, neighborhoods that aren't stable, people are moving in and out, homeowner homes are being converted to tenant occupancy, which is maybe a policy issue because you want neighborhoods to grow and wealth to increase through homeownership. The other side of that coin, of course, is that if prices are high, then people can't afford to live in that neighborhood. So the way that we address that is with cost burden rates. So that gets at that affordability portion. Because of course you do have, the way the data shakes out is that our highest cost burden homeowner neighborhoods tend to be the ones with the lowest prices because people's incomes can't support homeownership. So that's a good question and a nuance in the data that you can read more about if you read Appendix F, which talks about for each of those variables that I showed, how we decided which way to look at it. So great question. Yeah, it is. And I know you mentioned that our staff is, that this is technical, but our audience is up to it. So, and they ask great questions. A couple quick housekeeping matters. One, I was negligent in reminding people that we are recording the session, just FYI. Also, I did have to post that, in fact, the views I express and the panelists express are not the views of the Federal Reserve or the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond. They are their own views and so on. I had to say that. And then also you mentioned the Community Development Network. For full disclosure, I'm on the board of the Community Development Network. and proud to be. So just a couple other questions. So, you know, it may seem obvious to others, but maybe not. Why are the high need home ownership census tracts so concentrated in Baltimore City?
That's a great question, Peter. So let me bring up the static map here just so we can see it against the region. And I think it's a confluence of issues, and maybe I'll go back actually to the components of the renter index. So for all of these variables, basically you're looking at the neighborhood level, are these things above average? And in Baltimore City, you're going to find, yes, of course, it's Baltimore City. Houses tend to be older. You know, we tend to consider, in some places, older housing can be more valuable if a lot of money is put into it to fix it up. But older housing tends to be a liability and tends to correlate with public health issues. So that's a problem. We've got higher turnover and mobility. So people are moving in and out of these neighborhoods. I talked about the home prices. So home prices are either falling or they're low in these neighborhoods. They tend to have an older population on average compared to other areas. That's because new residents may not be moving in. These areas were, of course, hit hard by foreclosures and delinquency back in the recession that began in 2007. That's still an issue working through some of these neighborhoods. And of course, now we've got the COVID crisis on top of that. Another thing that we looked at was housing construction. In most of these neighborhoods on the outer fringes of Baltimore City, there's not a lot of construction happening, and that's true in West and East Baltimore as well. And then I talked about cost burden being higher, poverty rate's going to be higher, and the median income is going to be lower. So compared to the region, you know, you're going to have that confluence of issues in East and West Baltimore. Much more likely to be there than you are going to find in the suburbs. And of course, some places do pop up in the suburbs, like here in northern Anne Arundel, but it's most geographically concentrated in Baltimore City for the range of things that we looked at. So I hope that makes sense.
Thanks, Nick. Now, here's the question that is the overarching question of the entire session, but let me put it to you right off the bat. How do we reverse or alleviate the trends that we're seeing in Baltimore City?
That is a great question, and that's going to segue nicely into Laura's presentation. But I think what really matters, especially on the homeownership side, is economic growth and increased investment, and also helping people get onto the homeownership ladder. It's very difficult to get there in the first place, and you'll see some discussion of that in the report about how the state can make that easier. But it also means that we need more investment in our housing stock, period. So that's increased assistance to homeowners for repairs, but it's also additional housing construction, which will increase the value of these neighborhoods. So it's really, I can't answer that question in 2 minutes. We're going to continue to talk about that for the rest of the presentation today, but we do have a lot of solutions in the report. So I'd encourage everyone to look at that.
Appreciate it, Nick, and I think that's a good prompt for us to transition to Laura Seafoss's presentation. I see questions are still coming in, and I will pose them throughout the panel. So Laura Seafoss is the Senior Program Director at the Enterprise Community Partners. She is passionate about helping communities use their assets to solve the most pressing challenges. As a Senior Program Director, she has led or supported the development of more than a dozen plans focused on increasing housing affordability across the country. She has helped communities create more equitable housing policies and programs, more resources to support development and connections between housing and broader community goals such as transportation and education. Don't even get me started on transportation here in Baltimore. So with that said, let me turn it over to Laura, and why don't you give us your presentation? Thanks.
Great. Well, it's great to be with you all today, and I think Nick did a great job of setting up the statewide and regional context, and I'll be speaking more to the kind of national context and different strategies that communities across the country are taking to tackle particularly disparities in homeownership and the lack of affordable rental housing for extremely low-income households. So just to, I think, introduce myself again and the organization I represent. I work for Enterprise Community Partners, and I'll be speaking today from my experience working there with communities across the country. Enterprise was founded in the 1980s by James and Patty Rouse, and our mission is to make home a place of power and pride for people with an eye towards both racial equity, resilience, and upward mobility. So as I mentioned, I'll be kind of contextualizing what you heard for the state and region, starting with homeowners, talking about renters, and then closing with some key factors related to implementation that I've seen be really successful in my work working with communities across the country on similar issues. So starting with homeowners, one of the things that stakeholders in the Baltimore region, and I think more generally in the statewide housing needs assessment that was lifted up, was disparities in homeownership by race. And this is something that is not just true within the state or within the Baltimore region, but also nationally. Particularly when you look at the largest set of households that have the highest homeownership rate, which is white households, and the group that has the lowest, which are Black households, we see a very large gap, a 31 percentage point difference in their homeownership rates in 2019. And when you look to kind of the overarching trend among Black households, which have the lowest rate, you begin to see that that has actually decreased following 2009. In part due to the foreclosure crisis and who was impacted by that set of events. But more broadly, there's also, when you look to, you see these stark numbers, you can also trace it back to the systemic racism that exists in public policies, particularly racialized zoning, redlining, the map for which Baltimore, I believe, was created in the 1937, and then you see the Federal Housing Administration and Fannie Mae really start to institutionalize redlining in the same decade, and so that really creates the basis for our modern mortgage market. So I think it's important to understand kind of there are really systemic and longstanding factors that when you see a chart like this contribute to it. You know, the impact of COVID-19, the long-term impacts are still, I think, you know, being surfaced in the homeownership market, but the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard has been tracking this consistently. So if you're looking for kind of monthly data or something like that, they're a great resource. And when they look at how homeownership is changing due to the impact of COVID-19, they're really seeing that burden fall, particularly on households of color. That group is more likely to be behind on their mortgage payments as of, I believe, last fall as the data goes through, relative to the white homeowners across the country. So what are communities doing as they see and tackle these similar issues in their communities? So one, I think there's a big push to support existing homeowners in a range of ways, particularly through having home rehab programs that help make repairs, both large scale and small scale repairs, especially in tandem with code enforcement, so that people are living in high quality housing, they're able to maintain their home and maintain home ownership effectively. There's also community-based housing models like community land trusts that are providing affordable opportunities and keeping costs low, both for existing and potential homeowners. And then foreclosure prevention and mitigation, which is also something that the state of Maryland offers along with financial assistance to keep people in their homes. When it comes to getting people into homeownership market, there's a lot of different things that communities are doing, particularly around creating mortgage products that really work for the context in which they're going to be used. So that includes things like addressing appraisal gaps, which is common in places with high vacancy, small value mortgages, things like that. And that's especially important in areas that historically have not seen a lot of real estate transactions or have been undervalued by the real estate market over time due to some of that systemic racism that I mentioned. There's also ways for external partners to get involved, employer-assisted housing, and tax relief, both to help get people into homes, lower their closing costs through a credit or something like that, and also tax relief for long-time homeowners. So there's a lot of ways to stabilize homeowners, and particularly as we begin to chip away at that, racial equity gap, ways to really tailor products to meet that. So shifting gears to renters, I think the trend that stakeholders who help kind of uplift the needs within the region that Nick highlighted briefly around having a lack of affordable supply for particularly extremely low income households is again not unique to the Baltimore region. In fact, across the United States, there is a severe shortage for people who are essentially qualify as extremely low income by HUD standards. This is a gap of about 7 million homes. And so to kind of put that in, say that in a different way, across the United States, there's 37 affordable and available homes for extremely low income renters. And in Maryland, they're only, sorry, out of 100. So, and then in Maryland, that gap is even wider. There's 32 affordable and available rental homes for extremely low income renters, if they're out of 100, total renters at that. So what that really means is extremely low income households are essentially seeking higher cost housing, and that's creating a burden on them in terms of how much they pay for homes how much of their income they pay towards their housing every month. We call that cost burden if you're paying more than 30% or more. And that represents about 9 million extremely low income households. So what that means is there's less money for transportation, childcare, food, healthcare. So there's significant trade-offs being made, particularly among this group of renters as they seek housing. And when we look at who is being affected, it is particularly falls heaviest on renters of color, people working in low-wage jobs, and then people who may not be working or may be relying on alternative means to pay for their basic necessities, like seniors or persons with disabilities. When it comes to increasing the supply, I think it's also important to acknowledge that rental homes across the United States are not distributed equally. About half of all rental homes in the United States are in a quarter of census tracts. And on average, what that really means is there's very, very small amount of rental homes in the average census tract and in the average community across the United States. So what this kind of shows the differences, particularly in high homeownership and high rental areas, but also I think speaks to a finding that, again, has been lifted up by the Joint Center for Housing Studies, which not only are there few places where rental housing exists across the country at the census tract level, but also that is directly contributing to economic and racial segregation in communities. And I think as Nick mentioned, and again was kind of lifted up for the region, even if these homes existed, even if they were widespread in terms of their location, there are additional barriers that renters face every day to access them. This includes eviction, criminal legal history, credit history, and more stringent requirements to rent, as well as features that may promote being able to age in place or access a home for a person who has a disability. And it's important to note that many of these factors are self-reinforcing. So once you've experienced one of them, once you've experienced housing instability due to them, it often makes it harder to access public housing or rental housing because screening criteria often screens people out based on these factors. So there is a lot of great work that is happening across the country to really address this shortage and make sure that renters in particular are supported as they seek rental housing in the private market. On the whole, I would say it falls into two camps. So one is trying to produce new homes that really speak to the income levels that need to be served. This requires deep subsidy. So many communities have created their own local sources of funding and priorities to really target that gap. And they're using that in tandem with things like donated or below market rate land and other types of regulatory relief like reduced parking requirements, streamlined permitting, other things that are going to get these to the market faster, to get to people in need faster, but also lower the overall costs associated with producing them. The other camp is really making sure we don't lose the affordable housing that already serves these groups, and making sure they stay in good repair. And that is through things like, again, having capital to do acquisition rehab of these units and subsidize them, but also creating the policy environment where people can, particularly tenants, are able to live in these housing situations without fear of being displaced, both involuntarily and voluntarily, through things like eviction, and making it easier to access them. So communities are passing things like source of income protection, which makes it illegal to discriminate for people who are using essentially non-employment wages, so something like Social Security or a rental assistance voucher to access a home. Fair chance housing policies, essentially instructing landlords to not use things like criminal history through a certain time period to essentially enable people who may have some of those additional barriers to really start to remove them. And then other things like mobility counseling, high bar market rental, making sure that people are not only, those rights exist, but people are well aware of them and they're being shared with them in culturally relevant ways. Okay, so to I think wrap up, there's a lot of solutions out there. And again, I think the toolbox and the statewide housing needs assessment and the work, your own experiences can inform kind of what will work in your communities. But to close out, I wanted to mention just kind of factors that I've seen really help move these solutions forward in the communities that I've worked with across the country. The first is engagement. And we often talk about or think about engagement as a way to define needs. And that was certainly, I think, part of what we did for the statewide housing needs assessment, but also thinking about engagement as you are developing the solutions, who's going to be affected by the ultimate decision you're making sure those groups are able to weigh in and be at the table because they will make the solution more effective and stronger. Leadership, I mentioned, things like regulatory relief, zoning changes I didn't mention, but they're certainly baked into a lot of the changes communities are making. And that requires, strong leadership. Leaders need to be aware of what the housing needs are in the communities they're serving, and also what's possible in terms of the solutions. And that's where advocacy comes in. Advocates can be both a voice to really lift those things up, but also hold leaders to account when they are, maybe not necessarily, acting with the urgency that many of these needs suggest. And also showing up to show support, making sure that particularly people who may be coming out against know that there is a constituency that supports policies and resources and different approaches to addressing housing needs, particularly at the local level. And then finally, data, both quantitative and qualitative data, make a huge difference, not just in understanding needs, but also in being able to track and measure success. Are your solutions having the intended impact? So a lot of communities are baking that in through tracking metrics and things like data dashboards to report out what those solutions are also accomplishing. So they are truly making sure they're getting, those solutions can map back to the needs they're truly trying to address. Okay. And with that, I'm happy to answer questions or comments. And on my final slide, just added some data sources that have been really helpful in my work working across the country.
Well, thank you, Laura. That was extremely informative. And, I've been following the chat feature online, and people are asking questions and people are answering people's questions. And that's great. I wish someday, maybe next year, we'll all be in the same room to answer each other's questions directly. But even though some people have answered questions, I do want to pose a couple to you. First is, you did bring up the issue of zoning. And a question came up early on about the issue of that providing low income housing options, where to provide them. I mean, do you put them in areas of the most need and run the risk of concentrating further poverty, so to speak? Or how based on those zoning solutions and things you've seen around the country, how do you best utilize that?
Yeah, so I want to start by saying, it's a both and strategy. So, I will say, generally speaking, this is a trend we saw in the statewide housing needs assessment. Most subsidized housing, so the income restricted housing, is in only a few places, including Baltimore City, across the state. And there's reasons for that. There's political support, policies, statewide policies on how resources are used, as well as kind of unspoken things around, cost of land and other willing, acceptance. So I want to start by saying there's no silver bullet and there's no kind of one strategy that's going to get you there. But generally speaking, it's important to focus on how do you integrate more affordability into places where it historically has not been, and also how do you begin to invest in communities that historically have not seen the same levels of investment, and so as a result their housing is either not in good condition or undervalued. And I'll say, in my experience, those communities are often the best experts on what changes are going to help them. So sometimes it is a regulatory change, particularly if you're trying to move, create more housing outside of where it's historically been built. But in many cases, it's also a matter of making sure you're not overlooking the communities where people already live and making investments there.
Thank you. So a question also posed, there has been dialogue about, is why, from your experience, why have families, particularly African-American families, who have the same income level as a comparable non-minority family, white family, are so often falling behind in housing expenses and resources?
Sure. I mean, that's a big question. And, all the research that I have seen, all the people who have shared their experiences with me, I think it boils down to systemic racism in the housing sector. So, there are a lot of studies, probably one of the more well-known studies is by Raj Chetty, which finds that essentially households of the same starting point over the course of a child's life, all other things held equal, with the exception of race, results in, them being behind. And we've actually seen, so I'll say, I mean, from my perspective, it really boils down to systemic racism in the housing sector.
I appreciate that. We did get a request if we could somehow make the resources you have on your last slide available. I tried to paste them into the chat, but unfortunately the hyperlinks won't work that way. So we'll find a way to make sure that people have access to your slides and so on. So I appreciate it. I mean, on the issue of race, I mean, I get my job mandate from the Community Reinvestment Act of 1977, which, as people know about CRA, is primarily there to address the legacy of redlining. In Baltimore, it was perfected here. And redlining predominantly was a racial policy. It was perpetrated and inflicted on communities of color, to some degree ethnicity and religion as well. Ironically, the Community Reinvestment Act in Congress didn't address race directly in the implementation of CRA. Instead, it focused the need to access for credit based on income and really kind of left the issue of race out of the statute per se. That's at least one point of view. So, I mean, let me ask the question directly. I mean, how can we use the data being presented and policies you've seen to specifically address the racial disparity issue? I know that's another big question, but it's a question I think people often say is the obvious, or constantly, it's kind of the elephant in the room that people sometimes dance around.
Yeah. I mean, again, that's a really big question. I mean, I think the first thing is really being able to measure those disparities. A lot of communities are, undertaking disparity studies that not just look at disparities in the housing sector, but also in employment, education, other sectors. So I think that's really the first step, is being able to acknowledge and name those disparities using data, and also be able to contextualize them within the structural factors that have created them. But when it comes to, the fact that trying to use race-neutral tools to solve racial disparities, I think the thing I've seen be really effective is when communities design solutions that really speak to the needs of particular communities, even if they're available to everyone. So in the case of St. Louis, that was a situation where they created what's called the Gateway Mortgage Program. It's really a mortgage program to address appraisal gaps that exist in communities of color there. So it's designed to really serve a very specific need among a very specific population, but anybody can use it. And I think that's where, again, kind of the engagement and the qualitative data, along with the quantitative data, can really help you start to formulate solutions that are gonna address and close those disparities, even if you're not able to directly name race in the policy that you might be pursuing.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And thank you for bringing up the issue of the appraisal gap, because I know that has also been a focus of the last General Assembly. Our legislature began to try to put in legislation, or at least efforts to address that, which constantly comes up. All great questions. I do want to keep an eye on our time so that we can also open up time for further questions. So let me turn to our local practitioner, our Dan Ellis. Dan began serving as the Executive Director of Neighborhood Housing Services, better known as NHS, in September 2011. Since arriving at NHS, he's refocused the organization through an extensive strategic planning process. During his tenure, NHS has experienced significant growth and almost 240% increase in the organization's annual budget, and generated more than $30 million of capital to support Baltimore City residents. And it maintains an exemplary rating and the highest possible rating by Neighborhood Works America. And Dan currently serves as the second vice president of the National Neighborhood Works Association and chair of the lending committee, and so on. So Dan, you've heard the broader report. You've heard across the state, as well as specific to Baltimore region. You've heard Laura's assessment from across the field, and not only in this community, but across the country. So give us your perspective.
Good. Thank you, Peter, and good afternoon to everyone. I think we're now afternoon. So first of all, I want to give a little context to our work. I think I know a number of folks who are on that at least have shown up in the chat, and colleagues around the city. So good to see at least the names of a lot of our colleagues. Our work at NHS really flows out of what we believe. And I always like to, when I talk about the work we do, what we do, why we do it, it always starts with our belief and why we do what we do. And so at NHS of Baltimore, we believe that economic and social justice are a right for all people and communities. And that's a belief that fuels everything that we do. Part of how we look to do that is by removing barriers that exist for people to access that economic and social justice. And so we do that really in three main ways. One way is promoting home ownership. So we do a lot of financial coaching, home ownership counseling, and lending. So we are a community development financial institution. So we do lend money to low and moderate income communities. We last year helped 457 people buy houses. 72% of them self-identified as African-American, 22% self-identified as white. So we have hit a large percentage of folks who are minority people of color. The second thing that we do is we help people stay in their homes, because the most affordable home that someone can have is the home they live in, oftentimes. And so helping oftentimes legacy homeowners, people who have inherited the home, to be able to stay in their home with improvements, to be able to stay in their home with investment is often something that is a barrier for folks who are very low income. And being able to do that preserves that wealth and also preserves that housing for that family into the future. And so the third thing that we do is we work in community engagement work. And that work is centered for us in West Baltimore in the greater Mondawmin and Coppin Heights community. Our first two areas are citywide. Our third is focused. And the reason we focus is when you look to bring investment into community, if you spread it widely, you have very limited impact. And if you concentrate it, you can begin to have impact. So we do work over there in a couple ways. One is we do some economic development work. We're developing a food hall in West Baltimore. We do housing development, which we are focused right now on the Panway and Walbrook neighborhoods, just west of Coppin State University, for those familiar with the area. And we work in partnership with the local communities. And that's something that's critical to this work, is listening to the residents, knowing what they want, rather than going into a community as an expert. You go into the community to learn and to listen. And as the community identifies priorities, that helps to direct the way that we work. So the community that we work in, I'm going to spend some time talking about the housing development side, because I think that ties into our work or our conversation today. The community that we work in over in Walbrook and Panway is a community that has been historically disinvested in many ways, as has a large portion of the city, and has some of the challenges associated with that. But when you look at housing, it's really looking at it and saying, how do we use limited resources? So there are some amazing suggestions that are made in the report that Nick's talked about. And if you have time to, we were only able to scratch the surface today. As you look at the toolbox and as you look at some of the recommendations, there's some great ideas. Some of them are policy oriented, but some of them are really, we need more money and resources to do things. Right now in the country as a whole, Matt Desmond did a study a number of years ago called Evicted, where he talked about, he came to the conclusion at the end that about a third to 30% to a third of residents who need assistance and are eligible for it receive it with housing costs. So there is a resourcing issue that housing people affordably in this country has not been a priority. We put more money into significantly more money into tax breaks for middle and upper income people through the mortgage tax deduction. We put about $500 billion a year into that, compared to about $30 billion into affordable housing. So there is a policy priority issue if we care about affordable housing, and that's a resource question. But if we're looking at our work, when we look at development in a neighborhood and on the ground in the community, and there, as we are doing in West Baltimore, there's really two things that we look at, because there comes a point where a neighborhood becomes affordable to the market. Because with the limited subsidy we have, what I'm really interested in is figuring out how do we do more work with less subsidy? Because the subsidized work is going to be limited. It's limited by a finite pie that's going to be cut up in different ways, and we can advocate for different ways to cut it, but it's still a finite pie. And so really we look at how do we direct markets to behave in a way that we want them to behave. So in a neighborhood like where we're working, the first thing that happens is that the neighborhood becomes a place where developers or people, often not developers, where people can come in, they can buy a unit, they can put limited investment into it and place a tenant in it. So they can get the unit, it either is at a minimum standard where it can get a Section 8 voucher pass rating, or it can reach that point with limited investment with $5,000 or $10,000. And they can get $1,000, $1,200 of income out of a Section 8 rental program that then becomes sustainable to that property. When it reaches that point, the neighborhood begins to see a number of private investors come into a neighborhood and work in that place, putting in rental. And we see this in a lot of communities in Baltimore. The neighborhood begins to turn, that's been historically homeownership with legacy homeowners, and then it shifts and becomes much more of a rental neighborhood. The new work that's coming in is mostly rental, and community leaders talk about this quite often. And that's when it passes the first tipping point of you can see investment. We also have neighborhoods where it's very hard to get any investment going without significant subsidy, that even that rental work doesn't work well. The second tipping point, though, is when a neighborhood can move to a home ownership model. And that's a point that we try to help neighborhoods reach in our work. And the reason they're different is that rental rates in neighborhoods are often less controlled, at least in Baltimore City, by the market, and are more controlled by the value of Section 8, which is set on a citywide basis. And so when you set market rates based on a citywide basis, which is administratively how Section 8 is structured, you end up artificially inflating values in lower cost market and deflating values in higher cost markets because you have a citywide average for places where that happens. And in higher cost markets, you end up not being able to access because the landlords are going to go to the private market. So they just become non-accessible. And so that's really what sets the rental market. When you get to a point where you can sell a house, where someone can buy a house, renovate it to a decent standard for home ownership, sell the house and make money, that becomes a place where home ownership developers can begin to spend more money on the acquisition than the rental developers. And you pass that second tipping point, and you reach a point where you can really begin to see development happening for home ownership. And that's where we want to get, because otherwise you're just going to see developers coming in, putting some lipstick onto the house, putting in a tenant, and it's not necessarily helping the neighborhood. If we want to build wealth among minority homeowners, which is something we've talked about on a couple points today, it's really about helping the values in minority neighborhoods to increase. Homeownership is across the country the greatest builder of wealth for most people. But oftentimes in minority communities that is not experienced because the housing values are not increasing. And so if the housing values don't increase in minority neighborhoods, you do not build wealth like you do in non-minority neighborhoods. And so we're looking at figuring out how do we increase the homeownership rate? How do we help more people to be able to access homeownership? We work with renters who live in the community currently, who have an income and can potentially move to homeownership. We work to help them prepare with the financial coaching and all the supports that go into that in order to help them move so that they can benefit, so that as the prices appreciate, they're not pushed out. The concern that a lot of folks have around gentrification, which is something we often hear, is something that we are always attentive to, but most neighborhoods tell us that they want to see the neighborhood improve and the values increase. And that is what they're interested in, because that does build wealth for them and their families. And that's a value that we have. It's increasing the homeownership rate among African Americans while that's occurring. The rental rates are often controlled by the Section 8 values. And unless we go past those numbers, which is quite a bit past that homeownership tipping point economically, you don't end up necessarily displacing people at the same time. So as long as we're not pushing sale prices to $300,000 or $400,000 for a unit, if we're pushing them to the 180 to 220 type price, it's still affordable for someone below 80% area median income. And it is something that becomes a wealth building tool for those folks. Just want to touch briefly on some of the challenges that are encountered in doing this work. The biggest challenge to development in Baltimore right now is acquisition. It is not money. A lot of folks think that money is the barrier. It's not. I get calls every month from people who have $25 million to invest in Baltimore. Where should I work? And my answer is always the same. It's Philadelphia or Washington or somewhere else. Because getting properties in Baltimore is not a quick process. Vacant properties, typically in our experience, about 75% of vacant properties require some type of court action in order to be able to get ownership of them. It is owned by someone who is deceased. It has delinquent taxes. It needs a receivership action, some degree that requires a court action. And that requires city involvement. And the city is very supportive of our work. But that court process takes typically 2 to 3 years to move through the system. And we have 16,000 vacant building notices in the city officially. There's another 10 to 15,000 empty and vacant houses. The number is harder to pin down. So somewhere around 25 or 30,000 empty and vacant houses in the city. And so as we look at that, and as we look to find solutions in the city for that, the acquisition barrier is the biggest barrier. If the city or some entity, a land bank or someone like that, owned all the vacant properties in the city right now, we would be able to redevelop the city. We'd be able to do it affordably, and it could probably be done in the next 10 years. and you wouldn't need nearly as much subsidy to do it as we're looking at currently. And the reason for that is the barrier is acquisition. If it is a priority to create affordable housing, that's not historically been the priority of the city. They're interested when you buy properties from the city or they're involved, you typically have to pay the appraised value of the property as a nonprofit. So even though we're creating and have the value of home ownership and creating affordability, they'll turn around and give us a grant to help us, but on the property side, they view it as an asset and they want to maximize their return on it typically. The current administration is interested in reviewing that practice, which we appreciate, but that's going to take time to review. But previous administrations have always had the asset perspective in maximizing return for the city. And that's inconsistent with some of the recommendations in the report of trying to create units, removing barriers to access. And so what we're really looking at doing is creating markets that work. They work for home ownership, they work to remove barriers, they still work for rentals, and it creates diverse communities that are healthy moving forward. And then we're looking at solutions that are scalable. Because when we have 25 or 30,000 empty and vacant houses, but yet we have a need of, I think it was 80-some thousand units currently cited in the report, and another 90-some thousand needed statewide. You know, the need is not small. We have empty units, but it's not an easy thing to just pair them together, because doing one unit costs around $150,000 to $200,000, depending on the amount of renovation that's needed if it's a vacant unit. And some of them are more than that. And so those are the important pieces, highlighting the community focus and the lack of resources. So with that, Peter, we could talk all day about these topics, but let me take a breath, pause there, and see if there are questions that have come up in the chat.
Yeah, that's been wonderful, Dan. You're right. You can talk. We can talk all day about it, and you've mentioned some buzzwords that have, you and I have talked about, things like land bank and other issues that kind of the road not taken in Baltimore, if you will, and so on. Let me touch. You mentioned communities you've worked in. We have getting questions about, does, for example, NHS work in Southern Park Heights, for example, and so on. So let me ask you a broader question. What type of data do you look at to determine where NHS goes?
So in answer to the question, we work citywide for our housing counseling. Our CDFI work is all citywide. So we work in all neighborhoods of Baltimore. Our community engagement work is focused on West Baltimore. So our community engagement is the only part that is not citywide, but it's what we do, where we do our real estate development work. It's where we do our economic development work. The reason we're focused, so we use data. The best source of data that I've ever found is Binia, and I know most of us here know Binia well. I remember when we didn't have Binia in Baltimore. I'm a little old. And the gray hair doesn't show up on video so much, but I remember when Binia wasn't around and we were trying to scramble to find data, and it was painful and difficult. And now we have one source to go to that's collected the 25 or so data sources, probably more than that. That's been incredibly helpful for us. Ultimately, how we choose a community is we work with the residents. We work with the community, and we're invited into a community by the residents. We're looking for areas that have a plan and that have a need. We're working in West Baltimore specifically. We started that work following the Freddie Gray uprising in 2015. And it was a direct response to that. It was a community crying out for need because of disinvestment that had occurred over generations. It was about police brutality. It was also about disinvestment and lack of opportunity. And so we looked at it and said, how do we create and invest in place to try to address that? So we're continuing to do our citywide work. We invest millions of dollars around the city. We do down payment closing costs, which I know is talked about in the toolbox. Last year, we put out over $5 million of down payment and closing cost assistance. We're continuing to do that. We're doing some first mortgage loan programs that were alternate credit, non-qualified mortgage lending. first mortgage to make sure that communities can access. We do help people to be able to get their credit into place. But ultimately, how we choose a place is the place in some ways chooses us. We are not looking at expanding our community engagement work at this time. So you can all text and call all you want. I apologize, we are not. And the reason is that we're limited in our capability to bring in national resources. So we can bring in, several $1 million a year of national resources, but if we concentrate them in place, it has an impact. And if you spread them citywide, it doesn't. And we're looking to have an impact on place to bring about change that's positive. The area that we're targeting in West Baltimore, it's actually 2 CSAs in Binia's report. It's about 30,000 people are in that area. And so that's going to consume our attention for quite a while. There's about 2,000 vacant houses, vacant building notice houses. All of this comes out of Binia's data. So thank you, Seema and team, for the great work. So we know a lot about what's going on in our market because of the work the data that exists that the great team at Binia puts together every year.
Great, Dan. I appreciate that. We got a request for your contact information, and we'll make sure that's available, perhaps in the contact, but also if you go to your website, NHS Baltimore, you will find it as well. So I think we're closing in at the quarter and so I want to make sure that that our University of Baltimore Binia puts up its evaluation link. Thank you. Please do take that time and access it as quickly as possible before we close out the window, because we do appreciate your feedback to make these sessions, improve upon these sessions. So I got an interesting question, Dan, which is, why can't the city just use eminent domain to just start seizing properties and then flip them around? Which brings up one of my favorite topics. I've been in Baltimore, and I didn't grow up in Baltimore, but I've been in Baltimore for now over 30 years. In every mayor's election, there is at least one, if not multiple candidates who promise to bring back the Dollar House program. And I always chuckle because, one, I do feel like we already have kind of versions of the Dollar House program in vacant values and other things. But the other is that the Dollar House program, as it was created in the 1970s, was the result of a road that was never built, in which massive eminent domain swept through, including my neighborhood of Otterbein, and created this condition. So what's your thoughts? I mean, one, do we really have a Dollar House program? Is it replicable? And what about that eminent domain question?
Yeah, so two important questions there. So the city does use eminent domain to do some community development work. Eminent domain has a lot of controversy with it, as I'm guessing most people know. In many cases, the houses you're talking about probably have delinquent taxes. And in some ways, taking a property or acquiring it through tax sale has a lot less legal issues than an eminent domain acquisition. So eminent domain is not fast or easy. It is also a court process. It's not something the city snaps its fingers and takes the property, as you know, Peter. And so that's part of the issue with eminent domain is it is used, but it's used very strategically because it's not necessarily the easiest tool to use. And there's a lot of rules around it. As far as the Dollar House program, I have people ask me the same question all the time. My answer is that's great. I can give you a lot of houses for $1, but you don't have the $150,000 or $200,000 to fix it. And the reality is that if we go into a house where the roof is in the basement, which all of us have seen in Baltimore, the cost of fixing that house, if it's a 2-story house, is probably $200,000 plus because you have a lot of structural work to do. It takes a lot of technical expertise to manage that process and to do that. And so I think in many ways, if we gave that to somebody for $1, you'd have to probably give it to them and also give them $100,000 because that house might only be sellable for $100,000 on the back end or worth $100,000. So you can't even borrow the $200 to fix it if it's only going to be worth $100,000 on the back end. And so in many places, in many neighborhoods, that's not necessarily a solution that's tenable. It's really figuring out, ultimately the city's going to need to give those properties away. But it's also going to take subsidy to go with that. It's going to take investment that's coordinated because if you do it one house individually in an individual place, now you're an island in the middle of continuing blight, as opposed to having 100 houses that you may do that with and create a tool. That would be very expensive to do from an acquisition standpoint and assemblage. It's also very difficult in the sense of having money to do it. The city's had conversations about it. It's not lost or absent, but it's not simple to do. And to your point, Peter, the prior program really did result as a byproduct of a failed road. So.
I appreciate that, Dan. People are posting great questions. I do, however, want to respect the fact that we are at the end of our scheduled session time, and so on, not to say that we can't continue to have these conversations offline or in follow-up. So with that, I would like to turn it over. I want to thank our panelists, Nicholas, Laura, and Dan, for all of the wonderful work you've done, and so on. And I want to thank our audience for just fantastic questions and so on. And as almost as we would say in Passover next year in Jerusalem, well, hopefully next year in person when we can get a chance. So with that, I turn it over to Seema and Binya to talk to us about the coming events.